There is another method to solve quadratics. It is by using the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is all based on ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The key here is that it has to equal 0. All right, so what is the quadratic formula? The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So this looks kind of big and scary. It's really not once you get down to it. So let's look at an example. Let's say, for instance, I have x squared minus 4x equals 21. So this goes back to the key here that I have to have it equal to 0. So I'm going to move the 21 over and have x squared minus 4x minus 21 equals 0. I'm going to rewrite my formula over here just so I don't forget. So in my case, a equals 1, b equals negative 4. Notice we keep the sign that's in front of it. C equals negative 21. Okay, so what happens now? I have my A, my B, and my C. So I plug that information into my quadratic formula. So I have negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 21 all over 2 times 1. All right, so it looks big, but let's reduce underneath the square root. If we reduce that, it looks a lot cleaner and a lot easier to manage. So the negative of a negative is a positive 4 plus or minus. So I type in underneath the square root what information I have, which gives me 100 all over 2. So at this point, I need to simplify my square root, whether that's breaking the square root down by simplifying the radical or by actually completing the perfect square. So in our case, we have a perfect square. So I have 4 plus or minus 10 all over 2. So I'm going to split this now into 4 minus 10 all over 2 and 4 plus 10 all over 2. Well, 4 minus 10 gives me negative 6 over 2, which reduces down to negative 3. On the right side, I have 14 over 2, which reduces down to 7. So remember how we talked about that we would have at most 2 answers. Using the discriminant, we can determine how many answers we will have. Okay, the discriminant is the square root part. So for instance, if I have the square root of a positive number, I'm going to have 2 answers. If I have the square root of 0, I'm going to have 1 answer. And if I have the square root of a negative number, I'm going to have 0 answers. And the reason why with the 0 is we can't take the square root of a negative. To think about that, if I had negative 2 times negative 2, that'd be a positive 4. The only way for me to get a negative would be a positive number times a negative number, which won't happen when we're squaring our numbers. The reason why I'm telling you guys this is so you have an idea of how many answers you should have. Or if you get down to the square root of a negative, you know you can stop because you don't have any answers. So let's say, for instance, I have x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 0. A equals 1, B equals -2, and C equals a +1. Looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and plug in the numbers that I know. So I have -2 plus or minus the square root of -2 squared minus 4 times 1 times -2, not -2, times 1. Again, all over 2 times 1. So I'm going to simplify this. I have a +2 plus or minus the square root of 0 all over 2. Right now at this point, I know I'm only going to have one answer because it's the square root of 0. Well, the square root of 0 is just 0, so it's not like 2 plus 0 gives me 2 anyway. 2 minus 0 gives me 2 anyway. So it's just 2 over 2, which equals 1. All right, we're going to go through one more in which our square root might not simplify perfectly. So I have x squared minus 10x plus 22 equals 0. So looking at this, A equals 1, B equals -10, and C equals 22. I'm going to plug in the information I know and then simplify. So I have -10 plus or minus the square root of -10 squared minus 4 times 1 times 22 all over 2 times 1. I'm going to go ahead and simplify underneath my radical. So I have 10 plus or minus the square root of 12 all over 2. Now here's where the new part comes into play. 12 is not a perfect square, but I can simplify this square root of 12. I can break this down into the square root of 4 and the square root of 3. Well, the square root of 4 is a 2. So my answer then is going to simplify to 10 plus or minus 2 square root 3 all over 2. I'm not quite done yet. If, for instance, well, let me explain something first. So the reason why I'm not done is because this 2 in my denominator can go into the 2 here, and it can go into the 10. If that number, that your denominator, does not go into both, has to go into both numbers in the numerator, then you can't reduce it and you'd be done. But in our case, it goes into the 10 and the 2. It only has to go into the number in front of the square root. You don't have to worry about it going into the square root 3. So I'm going to reduce it like my fractions. So I have 10 over 2 equals 5 plus or minus 1 square root 3. And that's my final answer. We're going to work some more with this, and working on this formula, I'm going to show you some calculator tricks that might be faster for some of you, and we'll work on this more because this is a very important formula.